Today's scripture reading comes from chapter 2 of the story. Let's hear the word of the Lord. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse them. And all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going.
Last week, we took our very first steps in our journey through the Bible by reading chapter 1 of the story. Now, if you recall, if you were with us last week, the events of chapter 1 make up the first of 5 major sections of the Bible, or we would say movements in the Bible. Now, before we get started on chapter 2 and we keep walking down the path of this amazing story, I want us to make sure we are clear on that first movement. So I'm going to invite you to read with me on the screen the words of movement 1. In the beginning, God creates a beautiful garden, but Adam and Eve make a bad choice, so they have to leave the garden. Their choice brings sin into the world and separates us from God. So God makes a promise and launches a plan to get us back. The rest of the Bible is God's story of how he kept that promise. Now, there's 3 really important parts in this first movement that we read through chapter 1. One is creation. In the beginning, God creates a beautiful garden. As we go through the Bible, we have to remember that this is God's world and we live in it. We also have to remember we have a very special place in God's world. He made us, humanity, in his image so that we could know him and love him. In fact, that is our very purpose for existence, to know and love God, to be in relationship with him. That is his heart's desire, is to be in relationship with us. Second is fall. But Adam and Eve made a bad choice, so they have to leave the garden. Their choice brings sin into the world and separates us from God. When Adam and Eve sinned, it introduced death, spiritual death, physical death. It brought separation between them and God. We see them hiding in the bushes, hiding from each other. And in a moment, just a blink of an eye, the world was ruined. And the sin wasn't just a bad choice, it was a nature that infected all of humankind, like to every person who would ever be born. And the world stood now in judgment to God. And we see a picture of the severity of this judgment in the global flood, which everybody except Noah and his family was wiped out. And the last part of this movement is promise. And this is something we're going to be talking a lot about today. The first movement ends when God makes a promise and launches a plan to get us back. The rest of the Bible, which is going to be movements 2 through 5, is God's story of how he kept that promise. So God makes a promise that he will, in Genesis chapter 3, that he will send someone who will rescue and save humanity. He will separate humanity from the devil, from the evil one, from sin. And he would send someone who would crush Satan. He would destroy him. And this he would remove sin. Now, how is the Lord going to fulfill this promise? Who is this long-awaited He that will one day come? Well, it's Jesus. That's how God's going to keep His promise to save the world, by sending Jesus. And so the rest of the Bible is always going to be ultimately about Jesus. Now, why I wanted to go over this with you as a quick review is we can't lose sight of this as we go further and further down the path and into the story of the Bible. And we're in chapter 7 of the story, in chapter 13 and 19 and 25 and 27. We can't lose sight of the creation, fall, and promise. That is the foundation of which the whole story is based upon. But also we need to remember that we live in the same world as the Bible, right? We talked about this quite a bit last week, and we have the same God. We live for the same purpose as Adam and Eve, to know and love God. We are corrupted with the same sin. We are sentenced under the same judgment of eternal separation from God. We face the same death, spiritually and physically. We are offered the same promise, and we are given the same Savior. So in other words, the story of the Bible, it's our story too. We live in this same story. We're just further on down the road. So as we get into chapter 2 today, it really kicks off the second big movement of the story, the second of the 5 big movements. And if you've got your outline handy, you can circle to see where that candle is, and where that's the second movement, and that's going to kind of help us keep track of where we're at in the big story here. Now, unlike that movement 1, which was only 1 chapter in the story, movement 2 has 20. So we're going to be here in this part of the story for quite a while. Now, before we get into chapter 2, let's look at movement 2 and where we're going to be for the next 20 chapters. Let's just kind of take a peek ahead around the corner and see what's going to happen. So, and again, I invite you to read this along with me. God begins a new nation called Israel. He uses Israel to show us who He is and how He plans to rescue us. Every story about Israel gets us ready for the first time Jesus comes. Now, even though this isn't a Bible verse, it's a wonderful summary of where we're going to be. And I want you to notice the first couple words in the description of this movement, which is God begins. God begins. This is a key theme that we are going to see really in this movement and through the rest of the Bible. God begins. Another way to say this, looking in your outline, is that God always takes the initiative to fulfill His promise. God begins. God takes the initiative. Now, if you noticed at the start of our reading here in chapter 2, which the very beginning comes from Genesis chapter 12, it's God who approaches Abram, who later becomes Abraham, not the other way around. Abram is not seeking out God. He lives in a pagan land. He's almost certainly an idol worshiper, and he has been for the first 75 years of his life. God isn't even an afterthought for him. It is God who approaches him, God who comes to him first, seeking a relationship. It kind of reminds me of any time a couple dates or gets married. One of them is always the pursuer. So if you're sitting there with your spouse, which one of you was the pursuer? Which one was the chaser? That was me, for sure. I chased my wife for a year. And we were in high school, and she wanted to have really nothing to do with dating me. But I pursued and I pursued and I pursued, and then finally she relented, and we started dating and got together. But that's really God's role in this story. And in Genesis 12, God pursues, seeks out Abram, or later Abraham, and he puts his initiative into action. And he speaks to Abraham about his plan, what he's going to do. Now, if you have your copy of the story, you can open it up, and I'm going to be reading from page 13, which is Genesis chapters 12, 1 through 3. Now, what I want you to do as I'm reading this, I want you to listen for how many times I will say the phrase, I will. When God is speaking, how many times does God say, I will? The Lord had said to Abram, go from your country and your people and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. What did you come up with? I have 6 times God says in just these 3 verses, his first words to Abram, I will. And notice what's missing here. There are no conditions. There are no ifs. There are no contingencies. There are no, unless. There's no loopholes and clauses and fine print for God to, wiggle his way out of later. God is going to take the initiative for this rescue plan, and he will not be stopped. Now, speaking of the plan, what is the plan? How is God going to use Abraham to undo the sin of Adam? Well, the plan is this, that starting with a single man, God will build a family that will grow into a new nation that will bring salvation to the whole world. That's the plan, from a man to a family to a nation. And out of this nation will somehow come salvation. Now, in the early parts of this story, we see the nation called to be a beacon of light to the rest of the world, that God was going to bless them and reveal himself and live among them and give them laws and all these ways that would separate Israel from the rest of the world. So the world would look at Israel and say, oh, your God is the true God. He is a God of goodness and mercy and grace and blessing and holy and all that. And that's kind of Israel's role in this. But even more importantly and ultimately, this man that grows into a family, that grows into a nation, out of that nation will come that he that we met in Genesis chapter 3 in movement 1, this promise of one who will come to defeat Satan. So it's going to be out of this nation, out of the lineage of Abram, that this great deliverer, this great savior and rescuer will come. So that's how kind of this nation fits into the plan. And the stories of this nation are really important in the Bible. It takes up 2/3 of the content in the Bible and 2/3 of our copies of the story. And as we go throughout the Old Testament, and as we get into the New Testament, as we go through all the different movements, the Lord will always be the one who has the initiative. God is always the first or prime mover. God is not reactionary. God always moves first. He will recruit Moses while Moses is fiddling around in the middle of the desert by appearing to him in a burning bush. He will then seek out David to be this king while David is out tending sheep in the field. And from all around the nation, he will call prophets from every walk of life to speak truth and remind them of his promise to this wayward nation. As we go through the Bible, we're always going to see that God is the running after God. He is the chasing God, the pursuing God, the finding God. Now, we're part of this story too, because God is the same for you and me today. Do you know that God is the initiator in your relationship with him? God is the pursuer. God is the one who went looking for you, not the other way around. God came after you. Saving you was his idea. And if you want to see how far back this idea goes, look and read with me Ephesians chapter 1. For he chose us in him before the creation of the world to be holy and blameless in his sight. In love, he predestined us to be adopted as his sons through Jesus Christ in accordance with his pleasure and will. Do you see the beauty in this? He chose us. He predestined us. He moved first. And when did he do it? Before the creation of the world. Before Genesis 1:1, he already loved us. He had already set his heart upon us. And to be what? To be holy and blameless in his sight. To be in a pure, uncorrupted relationship with him. And he did this, it says, out of love. Out of love. And it was his pleasure. It was God's, his joy to do this. And it was his will. He made this his purpose. God is the pursuer in your relationship with him. And just as he did for Abram, God pronounces his blessing over our lives. Even before we were born, he says, I will, I will, I will. I will rescue. I will restore. I will resurrect. And I think the thing that we need to do with this is to rest in this knowledge of this unimaginable truth that we, as small and as frail and as inconsistent as we are the objects of God's great love. You are the object of God's great love. And so we don't need a self-help book to tell us that we're special and we're valuable. The King of the universe declares by his actions your worth. And by the joy it brings him to pursue you and to find you and to capture you. And we don't need to keep checking on our Instagram and TikTok's accounts for validation, which is honestly the plague of this generation. We're always looking for everyone else and strangers to give us a thumbs up and to tell us we're okay. Before you ever did anything, God set his heart upon you, and he has been in pursuit of you ever since. Can we let that be enough? Just let that truth sink in and let that be enough. The Lord, though, does more than initiate and pursue in the fulfilling of this promise. He also completes it. So moving on in our outline, God takes full responsibility to fulfill his promise to save. God is going to take full responsibility for this. Now, to make sure this point is made crystal clear, the building of this nation, the nation on which this plan of God will rest, begins with the most unlikely couple imaginable, an elderly and childless Abram and Sarai, who are past the birthing years, and even when they were in that prime part of their life, she was unable to conceive. Now, this couple, this elderly childless couple, they were not an accidental choice. By choosing this couple, for whom having a child was a biological impossibility, God was demonstrating that everything from the beginning to the end would be accomplished by him. And he will operate independently of people to fulfill his promise to save. Now, this is going to be very important for us to remember, this idea of God operating on his own to fulfill his promise. Because as we move through the story, we are going to meet a lot of people who do a lot of questionable, if not despicable things, and they are part of God's story of fulfilling his promise. Now, we saw that this week with Abraham and Sarah, and how they used Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, to produce a child. Now, the warning here is this is the first of many troubling stories we are going to come across, particularly in the Old Testament. And it leaves us wondering, like, what is going on here? Why is God using these people? They are so flawed. Like, why is this happening? Why is this part of the story? And the answer is this, that if God was going to fulfill his promise, he really had no choice, right? God has no choice in the matter. If God's going to work through humanity to bring this promise to bear, he's going to be using people who are imperfect and plagued by sin. Like, that's the whole problem, right? I mean, that's the whole issue. So if he's going to help, people be saved from sin, he's going to have to work with sinful people. And God, in his great love and his great pursuit, is not going to allow his promise to save the world to be foiled because the people he's working with make bad decisions. He would work through them and he would overcome them. Now, I want to be clear. God never excuses their sinful choices or behaviors. He doesn't condone it. But at the same time, he never lets it sidetrack him either. The plot of the story is always going to move forward because God's goodness will always be operating independently of the badness of the people who are, characters in God's story. And that explains why, as we go into, future chapters, we're going to come across murderers and cheats and liars and adulterers time and time again. Now, they're not mentioned in the Bible for us to exalt them or to copy them. Jesus is the only one we're supposed to really emulate and try to copy. But they are there to show how God worked in and through their lives to fulfill his purposes. Again, remember, he's the main character. He's driving the story. Now, there's a very familiar dynamic going on here. Again, as troubling as some of these stories and characters are, there's a very familiar dynamic going on that when God does something independent of those who will receive his blessing, when God does something and blesses people in spite of their behavior, not because of it, that word is grace. That is grace. That is God's grace. He gives to us what we have not deserved. He gifts us and blesses us beyond what our lives merit, and it is on every single page of the story. Now, of course, we see this played out most powerfully and stunningly in Jesus, when Jesus comes. I mean, humanity had done nothing to merit his coming. And in fact, when Jesus comes, most of the world rejected him. But he came anyway. That's grace. And then on the cross, Jesus takes full responsibility for our sin by offering himself as a sacrifice on our behalf, though we had done nothing to deserve it. So in terms of salvation, the story of Jesus, the pinnacle, the center point of the biblical story and of God's promise, we offer nothing. We contribute nothing to it. God has done it all. It's all been accomplished by his grace. He has checked every box. He has left nothing undone. And he is responsible for every absolute detail of it. So when we read through these scandalous stories filled with these unsavory characters, it's good for us to remember that we are no better than they are. And we fully rely on God's grace to save us and to sustain us and to work through our lives the same way he did in theirs. And that hopefully God is doing something in our life that will further his kingdom and his story just in the way he did with theirs. And I think it's also a good thing for us to remember that he is still at work, and he is still taking responsibility for our lives and our salvation. Philippians 1:6, a verse I come back to so many times in my life, says, Being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion. Okay, so he who began a good work in you, initiative, will carry it on to completion, responsibility, which is to say, we are firmly in the grip of God's grace. We are right now, and we will be until we breathe our last breath. And when we finally reach the end of this life and we arrive in heaven's glory, it will be because nothing we have done, but because Christ in his arms has carried us across the finish line. That's how we enter into heaven, firmly in the grip of grace, because Christ has taken responsibility for the fulfillment of our salvation. So this leaves us with an interesting question, does it not? Then, if God does everything, the initiative and responsibility, then what is our part in the story? I mean, where do we fit in? He starts everything, he finishes everything. So what do we do? Well, this is such a big part of chapter 2 that we see in Abraham's life, that people participate in God's promises through faith. It's through faith. See, God has done everything to fulfill the promise, but we only can enjoy the promise and the blessings that come with it. We can only know God in relationship through faith. That's our part in it. And faith is really nothing more than our choice to believe that we're going to trust in God and his promises. It is our choice to trust in God and in his promises. Now, we see this in chapter 2 of our story in Abraham's life three times so powerfully. One is at the very beginning when God calls him to go from your country to a land I will show you, to leave his home for an unknown land. And he leads a very comfortable life. And he's got to have a million questions of, where am I going? How long is it going to take? What should I bring? What am I going to find when I get there? But we see that he leaves immediately and with no objections. He just packs up and he goes. And that's how he gets to be a part of this great story that God is weaving through human history, because he had faith in God's promises. Second, he trusts God for a child despite the circumstances. This whole promise was predicated on him having a family, right? But he and his wife couldn't have children, and they were way beyond childbearing years. And Abraham ends up waiting 25 years for God to fulfill this promise. And along the way, there was really no indication that things were getting any better. But he believed in the promise of what God had said. He believed in it. And then third, when this child of the promise finally comes, Isaac, when he's about 15 years old or so, or older, we're not quite sure, there's a range. He lays him on the altar when God says to sacrifice him, which is unimaginable. I mean, to your son to do that, and not only is it just killing his son, it's like the whole promise was coming through this son. So God's asking him to throw everything away by sacrificing Isaac. But yet we see that later in Hebrews 11 it said, but he did it because he reasoned that God was going to raise him from the dead, that he would walk down that mountain even if he had to sacrifice Isaac. That is faith beyond faith. And by trusting and believing, God chose to respond to God's grace at work in his life. Now, Abraham was certainly not a perfect man, but he participated in what God was doing because he believed in what God told him, and he followed where God told him to go. Now, it's the same for us today. We relate to God. We're in relationship with God only through faith. Faith is the currency in relationship with God. We participate in God's promises by faith. perfect example of that is John 3:16, where we read, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son." Initiative, responsibility. God gave out of love. "That whosoever believe in him shall not perish but have eternal life." So there it is. That whoever believes in him, they shouldn't die or perish, but would live, undoing the judgment and the death that came in Adam's sin. So we see it right here. How are we going to participate in God's promise of salvation? By believing through faith in Jesus Christ alone. And that is the call that the church has been proclaiming for 2,000 years, to respond to Jesus in faith. That is, by saying yes to Jesus, by trusting in Jesus, by believing in Jesus, that we escape the penalty of sin, of death, of eternal separation from God, of the flames of hell. It is through Jesus Christ, faith in him, that we are saved. What must we do to be saved? To believe in Jesus Christ. And certainly, if you're watching this today and you have not made that choice, that decision, I want to remind you that God has pursued you. God has done everything he possibly can to pull you back into a relationship with him. And he is simply waiting for you to say yes to him, so that he can walk with you through this life and that he might carry you into eternity. If this is something you would like to do, I invite you to just hit pause now, to pray, to say yes to the Lord, and then to let us know, to tell someone, let's celebrate this together, that you are now standing firmly inside of God's promises. And if you are a believer, you've already said yes to this. My goodness, what a joy and duty it is for us to share this message with the rest of the world. But I want to finish with one more thing here, because believing in Jesus, and kind of like pushing a little deeper what that means, it means more than with agreeing with some ideas in our head. If Abraham's life teaches us one thing, it's this: that faith has feet. Faith has feet. When we believe in God, when we trust in his promises, it's going to take us places, and often to difficult places, often to unknown places. But faith moves us into a different kind of life. And if there's no feet to your faith, then I think we have to really wonder, do we have faith at all? James says something similar in the New Testament. He says, faith without works is dead. And we might say in our context today, faith without feet is dead. And so I want to just challenge you with these questions. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, and if you are trusting in his promise, where has your faith taken you? As you look back over your life, where has it taken you? How are you following the Lord today in your life? What things is he calling you to do? What are you trusting him for right now? What commands are you obeying even though you don't want to, even though they don't make sense? What word of God are you relying on even though you totally don't get it? And in what ways are you putting yourself completely and fully in his care? In what ways does your feet demonstrate your faith in Jesus Christ? And those are just questions I kind of want to leave with you and have you wrestle with this week. Because when God calls us to respond to him in faith, truly, we have no idea the path he will take us on. But we know where it leads, out of the grave and into life. And I pray that your feet may be faithful to follow him to the end.